Shall I go on and talk a bit about his next film? His first identifiably Wong Kar-wai film, which is Days of Being Wild, which more accurately translates from the original Cantonese title as 90 Minutes of Being a Dick to Women. Wong Kar-wai's sophomore movie and his first to be declared a bona fide critical success, Days of Being Wild establishes much of the tone that would eventually come to be seen as the director's trademarked MO, mainly an omnipresent atmosphere of languor as defective adults sit in anonymous rooms betraying one another's emotions. The first part of what would later reveal itself to be a 60s set trilogy, the action, or perhaps more accurately inaction of Days, takes place in a seamy Hong Kong that seems typically half-remembered and humid with nostalgia. In it we are introduced to Yuddy, a brooding Leslie Chung, as he basically psychologically abuses his way into the affections of Su Li Zhen, played by Maggie Chung, who is somewhat demure and unassuming, but because this is a Wong joint, also stunningly attractive. In spite of his cold and detached demeanour, Li Zhen is clearly besotted with Yuri and makes the mistake of mentioning marriage, at which point her beau makes his feelings on the topic clear by physically assaulting his way into the affections of showgirl Mimi, Karina Lau. Li Zhen finds some solace and emotional connection one night when, in the midst of an attempt at collecting her belongings from Yuri's house, she ends up walking the beat with police officer Tide, Andy Lau. Predictably, it's not long before Yuri tells Mimi to sling her hook too, this time propelled by a desire to travel to the Philippines and finally find his birth mother, an act that leads to an ultimatum from his adoptive mother, played by Rebecca Pan. All this plays out for the first hour until about 20 minutes from the end, at which point Yuri is suddenly shooting gangsters while sharing a hotel room with Tide, who apparently quit being a cop and left to become a sailor. Even taking into account the fact I had really terrible subtitles, I'm still somewhat baffled by this sudden turn of events, and that's before the final scene introduces a character played by Tony Leung, apparently apropos of nothing. Now, depending what kind of mood I'm in, I may try and source a better copy of Days with decent subtitles and watch it again, as I only really fell for Wong's later work, 2046, more of which in a later podcast, on a second viewing. Chances are I won't go back, however, as one of my prerequisites for revisiting a film I'm not 100% sure I've got a handle on is having a sympathetic lead, and Yuri is most certainly not that. While Leslie Chung, rest his soul, was certainly a handsome young man, I find it incredible that the character he portrays here would have had quite the effect he does on women, given the tactics he employs. Your mileage, as always, may vary, but I don't think I know a single woman who would tolerate a man stalking them at work each day and incessantly demanding they dream of him that night, nor having someone restrain and suffocate them to the point of forcing their mouth open for a kiss. Yuri is, in short, a total and exhibits none of the sympathetic character traits we would hope for from a leading man. If an early scene where he beats one of his adoptive mother's suitors hints at a soul capable of emotion, then little is to come of it, as from that point onwards he is equally a knob to her too. Unfortunately, we get to spend precious little time with the other main characters, many of whom are actually interesting and display vaguely human qualities, and who would certainly give the movie some much-needed heart. In particular, I would much rather Yuri were a background character in the story of Li Zhen and Tide, who it's hinted may have gone on to have some relationship, though I don't think it's ever directly implied. I may have Days all confused, in which case I'm happy to hear the argument as to why. Certainly I appreciate the atmosphere and cinematography, though not to the degree I did in 2046, for example, and there are enough people who argue this is peak Wong, even taking into account In the Mood for Love, that I have to at least consider the possibility that I am terribly, terribly wrong. But I don't think I am. Perhaps one of my friends here can shed some light.
You're not wrong.
Yay! I'm off to bed now.
Here begins, there are hints of it in As Tears Go By, but here begins a running theme through this episode of really, really unhealthy, unbelievable relationships full of creepy behaviour from usually men, but not always, and relationships that don't make any sense, and like, why would anybody spend any time with them, let alone this? He walks into the sports club that the woman's working in, knows her name, which is creepy enough anyway, and she never seems to push that. She asks once and never goes on, and then because comes back the next day, remember this minute we've spent together, and suddenly she's in love with him. Like, that's not how humans work.
Yeah.
So yeah, that is the biggest problem I have with this Craig Same Shoes. Like, the central character is an asshat.
Yep.
He's a spectacularly unlikable person, and there doesn't seem to be any good reason for it. He's just unlikable for the sake of being unlikable.
Yeah, I was thinking that. It's like, I don't necessarily need the main character to be 100% sympathetic for it to help work as a film. The problem with Yuddy is that it would work if I got the impression that he was a deep, conflicted character with lots to hide and all that sort of stuff,
Yeah.
but I don't. He's just angsty and makes poor decisions.
I wondered throughout if the fact that his adoptive mother, I can't remember if it's just suggested or if it's outright declared that she used to be a prostitute. I wonder if at some point we were going to find out that he was wrestling with his upbringing, watching the way that other men treated this woman that he thought was his mother, for example, and that's where he's learned his cues how to treat women. But then he's obviously clearly unimpressed by that guy who I think it's implied was trying to steal her earrings on that occasion.
Yeah.
And he kicks the absolute crap out of him. So then I thought to myself, right, okay, so clearly he's capable of emotion and there's some sort of protective drive there. So clearly he is capable of caring for people, but then he just goes on to treat her like an absolute pillock as well. And there's no real rhyme or reason to it. I just, like you say, Scott, perhaps I should clarify, you don't need to have a 100% likeable protagonist, but you need to at least have a handle on where they're coming from, and there's none of that with this guy.
They need to make sense. That's the thing. You can have a sociopath as a central character, and it can be really intriguing, fascinating.
Yeah, as long as you can parse them.
Yeah, there's got to be some sort of, you have to have an entity character. Well, they have to have a character, and he doesn't. He's maybe a character trait, or two at most, but he's not a character. And he's deeply unpleasant for the sake of being deeply unpleasant, it seems.
Yeah, it's very difficult to invest in anything that he's doing, and I didn't get the impression that this is why he's trying to be like Brechtian or anything about it. I think he's just a bad character.
Yeah.
I don't get it. Yeah.
And then like the other characters you think might be more again, Andy Lau, and I think a lot is just because I like Andy Lau a great deal. But his character's more interesting, more sympathetic. He's just like a regular nice fella, you know? But then suddenly gets pulled into a gunfight at the end, murders some people, and then, okay then, why are you doing this? And then, but never mentioned again. And then you're, Yuddy, sorry, I forgot the name. He gets shot, but apparently has several hours to bury his soul, but never considers, the former police officer never considers, getting him some help or something.
Well, it's been made clear that it's 12 hours to the next stop, so what's the point?
It's a bit like, was it Maximum Impact? We're talking about the fact that apparently the characters read the script and knew he had to die, so there was no point in trying to get help.
Oh dear.
Yeah. I don't know, there's in a sort of overarching way I kind of get the point of Days of Being Wild. It's like the polar opposite of a rom-com where everything's all messy and full of hurt and unrequited love and all that sort of stuff, and I sort of see at some level what the aim is, but it just didn't quite gel for me. And there's still certain things like here that all the acting performances are pretty much on point, and it's still a very stylish looking film. You can certainly see the in terms of directorial chops why he's coming on leaps and bounds, and you can see that in the film. And there's certain things that I can appreciate on some level for Days of Being Wild, but ultimately I just didn't like it. Mainly, again, as we mentioned, central character is just awful into awful things, and it kind of hit my limit of what I could tolerate.
What it does share with you, saying it's kind of the opposite of a romantic comedy, Scott, but what it does share with romantic comedy, though, is that bizarre belief that if a man puts himself in the vicinity of a woman for long enough and pesters her, well, obviously she'll fall in love with him. Yeah, and the final question I'm left with, like you mentioned, Craig, is what was the Tony Leung thing at the end about? It dropped in from a different film entirely?
Well, it kind of makes sense retrospectively in the sense of his character pretty much transitioning over into In the Mood for Love and then also 2046 in some sort of capacity. Whether I don't think it's directly the same character on paper, but it kind of is. If you get me, it's kind of like a redo of the same character, but from all intents and purposes, from what I gathered, like Wong Kar-wai didn't even have that in mind when he was making In the Mood for Love. So that's a thing that seems to have been retrofitted on. So
it's also not even in the same film.
No, exactly.
It's not in the rest of the film. So
that's it exactly.
It just appears at the end of the film.
Yeah,
for reasons.
That's what I mean. Though, is just it hadn't been planned as a trilogy, so there was that. As far as I can tell, in and of this film itself, there's no point in introducing that character. And I legitimately was sitting there watching it last night, and I thought to myself, whoa, wait a minute, did I do that thing where I've drifted off for 5 minutes and missed a really key scene? Because I wasn't actually 100% sure why Tide was all of a sudden in a hotel room with Yuri, and how they had managed to bump into each other.
Yeah, that's not clear. What he mentions at some point earlier, I think maybe somebody else in his family was a sailor, but he'd become a police officer, and then I think maybe there was like some sort of bit of joining narrative there, and that like he'd wanted to be a sailor or something. But anyway, he does go. He's in Chinatown. I'm guessing Manila, somewhere in the Philippines, which is where that guy Juddy had gone to find his mother.
Yeah,
it's not clear at all, especially because I'm going to the Philippines, what's a whole country.
Yeah, it's a hell of a with many millions of people. It's a hell of a coincidence that they just ended up bumping into each other.
But they do sort of try to explain it a bit, because he says to him, Chinatown here isn't that big. Basically, everybody ends up at this hotel.
Yeah. There is some. This is just where people from Hong Kong and China come to stay when they land in the Philippines.
Yes, but it's not the most strongly plotted thing at all.
No, somewhat convenient.
Yes.
Although I say convenient, it doesn't actually even make any sense narratively. There's no reason for them to have come across each other again, really. Most perplexing. It doesn't drive anything forward plot-wise because, well, Wong Kar-wai movies, ironically, given that he used to, or counterintuitively, given that he used to be a screenwriter, don't really operate on a level of plot. So, just bizarre. I was really worried that I thought, how much can I possibly have missed just from having had a bad set of subtitles? And I thought, I can't have missed that much.
No.
So, hey ho. I can picture a future in which at some point I just out of curiosity come back to this and try and make sense of it again, but I don't know. There's going to be a lot more things that I think will stop this getting to the top of my to-do list.
Will we move on then?
I think we should.
Yes.